Hello everyone, and welcome to the 248th episode of Analyzing Evil, featuring the characters and themes of The Witch. This is my favorite horror movie of all time. There are some that have come since that have entered into my list of greats, but none have been able to top The Witch for me so far. And so I thought it would be appropriate during this most spooky of months to talk about a film that I know many of you have been waiting to see featured in an episode of this series. And so in this video, that's just what we're going to do. Explore the dark recesses of a film that I hold near and dear to my heart, and that you just might too if you haven't had a chance to see it, which I definitely encourage you to do. Now without further ado, let's begin. To seek a place where one can live in any way they wish to is something that anyone who was unable to do so yearns for constantly. A desire for the shackles placed upon them to be broken so they might feel the freedom that we all deserve. However, there are those out there who believe their shackles aren't tight enough, that those shackles are not shackles at all, but open arms that have wrapped them up tightly in a loving embrace from which they dread escaping. The word we use for people like this is extremists, those who have taken their beliefs to heart so thoroughly that they wish to embolden, protect, and spread them as correctly as they can. The Puritans of early colonial America are often seen as being extremists, and when evaluating who they were and what they believed through a modern lens, that certainly seems to be the case. However, as many have noted, the popular view of Puritans as these prudish, overzealous witch-burners isn't exactly accurate. To be sure, there were plenty of Puritans who might have matched these stereotypes to a T. But like any peoples following a religion, the people who we refer to as Puritans weren't a part of some strictly established movement that ensured each and every one of them would act and behave exactly the same. All that being said, the word Puritan is actually a pejorative term invented by the public at the time to refer to the people who called themselves godly men and women, people whose chief ideological differences between themselves and other Christians were their belief that their faith should more so be centered around the teachings of the Bible alone, rather than those espoused by a church. And in fact, their beliefs were actually rather typical for their time. But again, like any political or religious group, there are extremists to be found nestled at the fringes of the Puritan movement. And if the Puritans as a whole weren't extremists, the man who heads the family we're shown in this story, William, certainly was. At the beginning of the film, we witness a trial being conducted wherein William is offering his judges a tongue lashing in regard to their faith, referring to them as false Christians who have strayed from the path they set out to forge by coming to this new world. So refusing to abide by the laws of a plantation and church that had become heretical in his eyes, William accepts this court's judgment of banishment and sets off into the New England wilderness with his family so he might serve his Lord faithfully and truthfully, unfettered by the constraints of the sinful and heretical. However, unbeknownst to this well-intentioned man of faith, this decision would end up costing him everything, for another type of extremist lurked in the wilds he and his family set out to find salvation in, one whose beliefs and actions lay in stark contrast to everything that William held dear. Since the dawn of human history, we as a species have feared the unknown and tried our best to make sense of the world around us the best we can. In our earliest days, we looked to the mystical, magical, and divine for answers, attributing the rising and setting of the sun to gods and their deific powers, and the seemingly unexplainable miracles worked by our fellow man to strange powers unlocked through delving into the secrets of sorcerous arts. And many a person who were simply practicing natural forms of medicine or engaging in scientific processes were vilified, labeled as witches, and punished for it, often executing them through horrific torturous means that were designed to deter anyone who might follow in their footsteps from doing so, which is a tragedy to say the least. That being said, the occult and occult practices exist for a reason. For as much as there are those who dabble in magic, or what appears to be magic for tame, innocent, or even benevolent reasons, there are also those who do so to sow evil in this world. People who endeavor to summon demons and commune with dark forces to empower and enrich themselves by whatever means necessary, even if that means laying waste to innocent lives to do so. These people, particularly women who engage in these practices, are known as witches. And when William and his family arrive at a plot of land on the edges of a thick forest, he and his wife were initially filled with joy, giving thanks to God for the good fortune he had bestowed upon them. And during what we can only assume to be the months it took them to build a home and farm for themselves, the family thrived. But all that would change when their infant son Samuel was taken from them. Whilst Thomasin was watching after Samuel, he was suddenly taken while she played a game of peekaboo with him, leaving his family to assume that he'd somehow been nabbed by a wolf while Thomasin wasn't looking. They don't learn the truth until much later, but we're shown what really happened almost immediately. for it wasn't a wolf that took young Samuel, but a witch of the most vile sort. The night that this witch takes Samuel, we're shown a scene wherein the witch first lovingly caresses Samuel before she grinds him into a pulp and rubs his remains all over her naked body, as well as some sort of stick, which is about as horrifying and disturbing of a death for a person, let alone an infant, that one can imagine. After she's done so, we're next shown this witch convulsing on the floor whilst clutching that same stick, before we're given a shot of her rising up in front of a full moon and flying. Clearly that stick is meant to be a broomstick, the classical vehicle which is used for flight. But as all of you likely wondered when this happened just as I did, why on earth did this disgusting excuse for a human being grind up an infant before doing so? Well, we have an answer for that. In an interview that Forrest Wickman of Slate magazine conducted with Robert Eggers, we're given the following exchange. The big early reveal in the movie has a witch churning up a baby and then bathing in its blood. What's going on there is another thing that you see in some English texts, but which is more common on the continent. The idea that a witch couldn't just hop on her stick and fly, but instead she needed an unguent, an ointment, to help her fly. I think even some modern witches today make flying ointments, and they have potentially hallucinogenic properties, which induce a state that makes it seem like you're flying. But the lore in the day was basically that the active ingredient of this unguent was the entrails of an unbaptized babe, and the baby, Samuel, given that his family was far from the settlement, and also given that Puritans had weird ideas about baptism, he was susceptible to that. Well, that makes a lot of sense. A horrific amount of sense, but sense nonetheless. But why then does this witch target the rest of the members of this family? With Samuel's abduction, there was at least a utilitarian purpose to it, but as for the torment, murder, or abduction of William, Kate, Thomasin, Jonas, Mercy, Caleb, and even their animals, there doesn't seem to be any particular reason why the witch would do so. Well, evil can sometimes be senseless, but in this case, there are two distinct reasons why this woman chose to torment this family: the chance to add another member to her coven, and the opportunity to sow evil on behalf of her master, the devil. The witches depicted in this story are clearly the servants of the devil, as these witches are mere images of what real-world Puritans believe witches to be: occult magicians who have made a pact with Satan, who then serve him as they serve themselves. As servants of the enemy of God and man, then, it's reasonable to assume that the primary witch we see tormenting this family in this story is doing so as an act of service to her lord and master, a lord and master that has deigned to appear at this humble farm in the guise of the goat Black Phillip. And in typical devilish fashion, Satan and his witchy servant torment these people by taking what's dear to them, corrupting them, and mocking their faith, all of which slowly drives wedges between each and every one of them as their psyches devolve into paranoia and rage due to the adversity the witch puts them through, and the strife they suffer through as their new home becomes increasingly more inhospitable. Samuel was an unbaptized babe, and he was taken and slain because he did not enter a covenant with God through baptism due to his parents' abscondment from their village, leaving him unprotected and vulnerable to the evil that lurked in the woods. Something that's not at all his fault, but rather something that adds to the notion that everything that occurs in this story ultimately falls back onto his parents, which is something we'll be talking about more as we go along. Sam's disappearance causes Kate to become despondent for over a week, crying profusely in her bed after suffering through several sleepless nights, all the while growing more resentful of her eldest daughter Thomasin, blaming her for being the one responsible for his disappearance. Tensions only rise as the twins, Jonas and Mercy, do as children are wont to do and play and irritate their parents and siblings with their antics, whilst they try their hardest to make it in this dreaded environment, giving us our first notion that something may not be right with the family's billy goat Black Phillip, with Jonas and Mercy singing rhymes about him and his kingship that seem a bit too sophisticated for two young children to conjure up on their own. And with their crops failing, their chickens producing corrupted eggs, and William's poor efforts to trap and hunt showing us just how well prepared he was to care for his family away from civilization, showing us just how dire of a situation this family is in. William only makes things worse with his lies as well, as sometime before the story begins, he took a silver wine cup his wife inherited from her father and traded it for a set of traps to use, something that he once again did with good intentions, but something that also causes Caleb to lie for in order to keep his father's secret, by saying he and his father went into the forest after Kate caught them returning from it to find apples that Caleb had scouted out. And this lie also eventually causes Kate to become more enraged with Thomasin, as she falsely accuses her of stealing her cup due to the rage and sadness over Sam's loss clouding her judgment. And both of these consequences of William's actions here are integral to the ultimate destruction of this family, which we'll get to in a moment. Now, towards the beginning of the film, we see that Caleb has begun to experience a sexual awakening, and he has been sinfully lusting after his sister, something you can't exactly blame him for considering she's the only girl nearby that's around his age. But regardless of whether or not it was his sister he was fixated on, The feelings brought on by puberty are something that are both a weakness and a source of shame for a boy who was doing his best to adhere to his parents' teachings, a weakness that's easily preyed upon. After Kate accuses Thomasin of stealing her father's silver wine cup at dinner one night, she and William discuss sending their eldest daughter Thomasin away due to her getting her womanhood, which would allow them the luxury of having one less mouth to feed should she leave the farm, something that Caleb aimed to prevent by going out into the forest to hunt for food before that could happen. However, Thomasin catches him preparing to leave, and she convinces Caleb to take her along with him, and with his sister and the family's dog Fowler and their horse Bert in tow, they set off into the forest. Now so far, we've seen the witch physically affect this family through the kidnapping of Samuel, and we've seen Satan do so in a way as well, through what we can assume to be his covert conversations with Jonas and Mercy, which is likely where they learn the rhymes they sing about him. And while both these things did much to degrade the psyches and morale of this family, the next act of evil unleashed upon them by the witch would nearly shatter them. While Thomasin and Caleb were traveling through the woods, they spy a familiar sight, a rabbit that had already made an appearance at the farm. Now this rabbit could be one of two things. It's either the witch's familiar, a supernatural being in the form of an animal that a witch binds to them to serve them, or the witch disguised as a rabbit. But regardless of whichever it is, once Fowler spied it, he started to pursue it, which then caused Caleb to chase after him deep into the forest. After finding Fowler disemboweled, he tracks the rabbit until he comes across a moss-covered cottage in the woods, hearing along the way the bleating of a goat echoing in the background. And as he stands staring at its door, out from its steps emerges something out of his wildest fantasies, a beautiful woman dressed in ways his young Puritan mind could scarcely imagine. And it's here that we once again find the witch exploiting a weakness in her quarry, much like she did with the unbaptized Samuel. Using Caleb's newfound interest in women against him, the witch has put on a glamour here to change her appearance into this seductress, which is a type of magic one uses to conceal their appearance, using it to prey on a young man's natural fascination with the opposite sex, to ensnare him in her grasp. When Thomasin eventually makes it back home, the family is understandably distraught after losing yet another child. But as night progresses, Caleb actually returns home, albeit naked and gravely ill. In short order, we learn that Caleb's illness is no mere sickness, but in fact a curse that torments him mightily as he slumbers, and even affects the farm further, as when Thomasin is milking a sheep, the sheep produces only blood rather than milk, which is something else Robert Eggers commented on in that Slate interview I mentioned a while ago. Witches would very often steal milk from farm animals, dry up the animal's milk, turn their milk to blood, curdle their milk, and drink it. Sometimes they would take the forms of other animals to do that. Also, witches had familiars, which were sometimes in demonic shapes, and more often in the forms of everyday animals. The black cat that we associate with witches is a witch's familiar. The witch, being an anti-mother, would feed these animals with her blood that came out of her nipples. Note, this explains a certain scene with the raven that comes later. But it's once Caleb awakens with Mercy and Jonas acting as if they're afflicted as well, and putting the blame on Thomasin for all their woes, that things become all the more harrowing. "Get the broadaxe, cut off her head," Caleb shouts over and over again. "She's upon me. She kneels. My bowels. My stomach. She pinches." Another frenzied and repetitive cry follows, this time only a single word. "Sin," underpinned by Mercy and Jonas' screaming. Then Caleb passes out again, and suddenly out of his mouth comes a rotten apple, a symbol perhaps of the devil's tempting of Eve with the apple in the Garden of Eden, just as the witch tempted Caleb with her body, and possibly a nod to the lie Caleb told earlier about finding a grove of apple trees, a punishment for another of his sins. Then the family starts to pray over Caleb, hoping to cure him of this demonic plague that ails him. But then Caleb suddenly wakes up and begins speaking again. It's her, a cat, a crow, a great black dog, a wolf. She desires of my blood. She sends them upon me. My Lord, my Jesus, save me. She sends devils. I am thine enemy, wallowing in the blood and filth of my sins. For thou art with me. Cast the light of countenance upon me. Spread her for me the lap of thy love. Wash me in the ever-flowing fountains of thine blood. Wholly thine I am, my sweet Lord Jesus. My Lord, my love, kiss me with the kisses of thy mouth. How lovely art thou, thy embrace. My Lord, my love, my soul's salvation, take me to thy lap. It's at this moment that Caleb perishes, crying out for his Lord to save him from the beasts that haunt his mind. And in this moment, we're left with a few things to ponder. This could have been the sincere plight of a dying boy wishing to be saved from his curse, a true desire for relief from his torment. However, Caleb, who speaks these words while staring at the ceiling and ignoring all around him, seems to be in some sort of trance, so unfortunately, that seems unlikely. What does seem likely is that this is meant to be an elaborate mockery of this family's faith in Christ by Satan and his servant, and more specifically, of its matriarch Kate. Prior to Caleb's awakening, we receive a scene where William and Kate are having a heartfelt conversation, and Kate tells William a story about a dream she once had. Once when Kate was Thomasin's age, she dreamt that she was with Christ upon earth, and it was reassurance of the pardoning of her sins. In that moment, she felt so ravished with his love for her that she thought it exceeded the affections of the kindest husband. And since Samuel disappeared, she has begun to experience a crisis of faith and fears that she can't ever feel that same measure of love again. Knowing of this story, which she told over Caleb's sleeping body, the devil and the witch then used it against Kate to mock her silly and childish love for her savior, disintegrating her psyche further as she's forced to watch her son express that same love for Christ just before he expires. And in doing so, not only is Kate made a fool, but their beliefs in general are made foolish as well. For as much as this family has time and time again looked to Christ for salvation, to eliminate their woes and deliver them from evil, not once did this light enter their home to do so, not even in their darkest moments when one of their own was crying fervently for him to save him. This is the beginning of the end. Caleb's death brings more strain upon the family, and Jonas and Mercy's accusation that Thomasin is a witch, and her subsequent protestations to her father about his fault in all this, leads William to board the twins and Thomasin up in the goat pen for the night to determine the veracity of their claims. During the ensuing night, Kate suffers a nightmare wherein her silver cup is safely back in her home, with Caleb and Sam there as well. Caleb talks to her in a low, gravelly voice, imploring her to look at a book he's brought with him, so she might gain the ability to see them often. But before she can look at it, she grabs the ethereal Sam from Caleb to feed him, and shortly after, we see that this dream is not just a dream, but a hallucinatory vision, as we soon find Kate feeding not Sam, but a raven who had returned Sam's swaddling blanket to her. At the same time, Thomasin and the twins hear a thud as something lands on the roof of the goat pen, a thud that we soon learn is the witch herself come to feed on the sheep she had cursed. When morning arrives, we're shown confirmation that Kate's vision was indeed real through the blood staining her nightgown, and when William exits the home, he finds that the goat pen has been destroyed, with the throats and bowels of his sheep slashed open, Jonas and Mercy missing, and a bewildered Thomasin lying amongst the carnage. In a flash, Black Phillip appears out of nowhere and gores William, prancing about happily afterwards as William's last words escape his mouth. "Corruption, thou art my father," before Philip rams him once again and pushes him into a pile of wood, burying him beneath it and ending his life. And this final moment of William's existence is rife with symbolism. As I mentioned earlier, William is the source of all the misfortune that has befallen this family. It's his rift with the church and zealotry in regard to his faith that spurred his family's move into the country. It's William's inability to provide for his family that then places them in a dire position that would have sealed their fates if the witch hadn't. It's William's lie about his wife's cup that further fractures his family. And it's William's refusal to recognize his errors in judgment and shortcomings that ultimately sees him and his entire family falling prey to the very antithesis of everything that he held dear. Hypocritical and prideful, all this man could do in the wake of his failures is chop wood, taking out his frustrations by doing the only thing that he could seemingly do right. And after racking up a sizable pile of wood and failures, both come crashing down upon him to seal his fate. Kate, though not as responsible as William for her family's predicament, also meets her end due to her own failings, specifically her failure to be an adequate, loving, and understanding mother to her eldest daughter Thomasin. Ever since Sam's disappearance, Kate has blamed Thomasin, and she continued to point all her ire at her for every misfortune that ended up befalling this family. None of it was her fault, of course, but she believed it to be, and in her last exchange with her, all Kate had to offer her daughter was rage and hatred, both of which led to Thomasin tearfully ending her own mother's life as she endeavored to defend her own. This is all the destruction that befell this family, total destruction wrought by the poor decisions of a patriarch and the malice of a demon in human flesh and the very Lord of Evil himself. But total destruction isn't exactly accurate, as there was one member of this family left standing to tell the tale of what transpired here, and unfortunately for her, that was by insidious design. I here confess I've lived in sin. I've been idle of my work, disobedient of my parents, neglectful of my prayer. I have in secret played upon thy Sabbath, and broken every one of thy commandments in thought, all of the desires of my own will, and not the Holy Spirit. I know I deserve all shame and misery in this life, and everlasting hellfire. But I beg thee, for the sake of thy Son, forgive me, show me mercy, show me thy light. This is the prayer of confession that Thomasin makes in the beginning of this film, and it's perhaps this admission of her sins that ultimately drew the witch and her master to her family's farm. The night Thomasin is forced to kill her mother, she beseeches Black Phillip to speak with her, as he did with Jonas and Mercy, and after accepting her request, he does so, transforming into a handsome man wreathed in shadows, who's garbed in what looks to be dark clothing that one might expect a Puritan to wear. "What dost thou want?" says the devil. "What canst thou give?" responds Thomasin. "Wouldst thou like the taste of butter, a pretty dress? Wouldst thou like to live deliciously? Wouldst thou like to see the world? What will you from me? Dost thou see the book before thee? Remove thy shift. I cannot write my name. I will guide thy hand." It's at this moment that Thomasin gives herself over to evil for the promise of a better life. A life of riches and wonder that she so desperately craved, and a life the devil is so readily willing to give. This book she signs, the same book that Caleb presented to his mother in her vision, is the Devil's Book, a legendary tome said to be the method Satan uses to bind witches to him and grant them the powers they desire. And that is exactly what Thomasin becomes, a witch, the very thing that destroyed her family and the enemy of the god her parents had raised her to serve so fervently. Taken into the woods to join her new coven, Thomasin witnesses the fabled witches' Sabbath and their chanting of the 11th Enochian key, a funerary rite employed by occult magicians. Oxia ial, holadod, zirom, kakorakso, odvabazira, kamaliaksod, bahal, nieso zaluman, telokoad, para, aladonod, noan, kasaraman, holaka, gohud, zagado, ziladar, zonjnieso, bagale, abaramaj, pinanakapa, zakareka, od, zamaranodo, kikale, kaa, zoraje, zira, noko, hoatuha, setan bavafod, lonaso, lonasa, lonado, babaje. The mighty seat groaned aloud, and there were 7 thunders, and the eagle spake, and cried with a loud voice, "Come away from the house of death." And they gathered themselves together, and became those of whom it is measured, the everlasting ones, who ride the whirlwinds. "Come away, for I have prepared a place for you. Move therefore and show yourselves. Open the mysteries of your creation. Be friendly unto me, for I am the servant of the same, the true worshipper of Satan, in glory and power exalted, of the kingdom of the south." With this rite, Thomasin perishes, and a witch is born, a servant of the devil uplifted from the mortal and divine shackles that bound her to become something more and something less all the same. Ultimately, the evil found in this story is not brought forth from a single thundercloud of malice, but a violent raging storm of malevolence. The dour zealotry of a man who feared his god more than he loved him brought ruin to this family, and the inroads of that god's enemy who feeds upon that fear sealed their fates. But it is not just the machinations of a single entity that brought about the cataclysmic events of this tale, but the very struggle we all endure to better ourselves for the sake of civilized society, in the face of our natures, and the fragility we reveal in ourselves and those we love as we attempt to do so. The vulnerability of a babe made unsafe by the wilderness his parents forced him into. The overprotectiveness of a mother that sees her thoughts and feelings poisoned against her own kin. The desire of a father to provide and protect that leads him to prideful and hubristic errors that accomplish the opposite. The whimsy of children and their susceptibility to outside influences, and the sexual desires of a growing boy that's just as susceptible. But most of all, the freedom of choice we all desire in life. Our natural beginning as shapeless beings with unlimited potential, who are often stifled by those that have come before us and all that they have built. And it is in Thomasin, a girl who shamed herself for a desire for that very freedom, that we find a sense of immense despair. Despair in a girl forced into a horrific situation, who was then transformed into an echo of that horror. An echo who in her own right would surely come to unleash terror over the many long years of her now unnatural life. And while the fault may ultimately lie with the aggressors in this story, the witch and her devilish master, their actions were only possible through the exploitation of the flaws and weaknesses that were found within their victims. For like a fire feeding upon kindling and air, so too do villains need something to feed upon. And if you're not careful, you too can become a meal, sustenance for the malefactors and dark forces of this world, who seek to burn you, everyone you love, and even the world itself, in a raging inferno of evil. Thank you all for tuning in to this episode of Analyzing Evil, and I hope you enjoyed. What are your thoughts on the witch? Did I miss anything? Let me know down below, and leave a suggestion for a villain you'd like to see featured while you're at it. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up button, and make sure to subscribe if you haven't already. A big thank you to all of my subscribers, my patrons, my members, anyone who's decided to honor me with a super thank, and especially Elijah Kai VA, our Dark Lord channel member. And a most vile thank you to those whose names you're seeing on screen now. Join the channel's Discord server and subreddit to interact with myself and the community, and follow me on the social media platforms listed below to keep up with the channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll be seeing you soon.